I bought this, so you didn't have to. So as all these lens manufacturers are racing to be the first, Blazar has come out with the new Apex 50mm T1.8, and it's for your crop sensor cameras, but it's anamorphic. Now, I do have a couple things to say about this lens, the way it's built, how it performs, and what you're exactly going to get out of this. But don't worry, there's a reason why it's called the Apex. Now, it's no secret that Blazar is probably one of the top manufacturers for anamorphic lenses, as well as creating a more budget-friendly option. And I've had a ton of experience using the Rima series in the past for their full frame and their crop sensor lenses, which have been great in my opinion because you have a vast range of lenses to choose from, as well as some characteristics that have been known to be popular amongst a lot of YouTubers, filmmakers, and creators. So when they decided to release this, I knew I had to be one of the first to actually test this out because this would actually change a lot of the way cinematographers work and how they use their cameras. Now, as one of the two current options out there for an anamorphic lens, this is the smaller option at a 50mm equivalent on an APS-C sensor. Now, Blazar has decided to continue with their build and design with an all-metal body as well as the similar look. You do have a readout on the edge here so you can see exactly how far your focal distance is in feet, and they do have hard stops. Now, this lens does weigh in at 717 grams, so not heavy but also not light. Either way, it's still compact though. And currently they only have it in a Sony E-mount, so there really isn't a lot of options. You can adapt this lens to other kind of systems, except you'll still lose that autofocus capability depending on the adapter. And I will say you may run into some issues, but we'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. Now, the lens does have a 77mm thread on the end, so you don't have any capability of a direct matte box and will have to use an adapter. But if you own any previous Blazar lenses, this is pretty much a similar size and build with everything pretty much almost exactly the same. Now, one of the ways that you can actually tell that this is an autofocus anamorphic is the orange bit at the end here, which helps signify that this is their Apex line. But you'll also notice that there is no actual gear ring for their T-stop here. So if you did want to somehow adapt this to a follow focus system, you won't be able to do so without a gear ring, and it might be a little bit difficult just because of how tight it already is. Now, I suspect that one of the reasons why this lens is slightly smaller is the fact that they actually did get rid of that gear ring, which is not a big deal at all. But for those that do want to run something with a follow focus, it's going to be a little bit difficult. But I will say, because it is a lot smaller and thinner on the gears, it'll be a little bit harder to kind of pick up, especially if you're going handheld. Now, I will say that there is something a little bit strange about this aperture ring, and it's the fact that you can't actually lock it or change it in your camera. I don't know if you can see this here, but it is at 1.8, and when I rotate it, it does recognize it. However, I can't actually change it on my aperture dial here. So while the aperture is recognized in camera when it's moved, if you accidentally touch it or kind of bump it, it will automatically change it and you're not actually able to lock it. Now, the only thing that is on this lens is their manual and autofocus toggle, which has a nice click, just like that. But other than that, there's actually nothing else that is on this lens to help navigate the autofocusing features, and it's pretty much a plug and play. Now, getting into the lens itself, you do have a D-squeeze ratio of 1.33, and for its size, I think it's really impressive that they were able to fit all this in a tiny ratio, not to mention how much glass you actually have inside of this that allows this to work. Now, when I first threw this lens on, I actually threw it on an FX3. While it's not an APS-C sensor, I really wanted to see how much vignetting was actually going on for a lens like this. And let's just say, compared to the Sirui equivalent, there was definitely a lot more vignetting happening in this lens. Now, it's no fault of Blazar because this is for an APS-C sensor. However, that was also made for an APS-C sensor and there was very minimal vignetting, which again isn't a bad thing because this is for an APS-C sensor, but it's just something to note compared to the other version that is out there. Now, something that I also noticed about this lens that might be related to quality, I'm not too sure, but there was a little bit of dust that was located inside of the lens, and while it's not at all visible when you're shooting, it's just something to note or kind of notice when I first opened it up. Not a big deal, honestly. It's like literally one speck. I'm just gonna stare at it all day though. knowing that it's there, even though I cannot see it at all in camera. Now, straight out the box, as soon as I threw this lens on, I immediately noticed the difference between the two. The Blazar itself has a lot of character in terms of how it looks and the kind of tones that you're getting. Number one, you're getting a completely different look in terms of bokeh and depth of field. I honestly noticed a very creamy look to it, and it was just pleasant to look at. As soon as I threw this lens on, the bokeh was very prominent. It had a very Blazar look to it, if I might say. You can also tell that this lens has a little bit more character just because it's not as surgically clean. To me, the colors had a little bit of a yellowish green tone. And in all honesty, it played very well in the warm tones that I was shooting in. You can also tell that in the lens itself, your highlights aren't exactly blown out, or they're a little bit softer. So that means skin tones look just really good in it. And on top of that, with a 50mm equivalent at an anamorphic ratio at 1.33, I just had a really good looking scene, especially with a lot of the shots that I was working with. Additionally, out of this lens, you get almost no focus breathing, and you also get a 1.5 kind of look, if that kind of makes sense. So while this lens does technically have a squeeze ratio of 1.33, you are getting a look of a 1.5 a little bit more. And not to mention a t-stop of 1.8, you are able to use this in low light scenarios, and with the fact that it is used on a crop sensor camera, you are getting a look of around T2 or a 2.5. But in my opinion, it still looks really good. As you can see in some of these sample shots, you're getting a really shallow depth of field, and even in low light on an APS-C sensor, I was able to get some great shots even when the image was leaning towards more of a darker tone, which actually made me appreciate this lens a lot more. Now, I was testing in a medium-sized environment that did have a lot of light at times, as well as a lot of darker scenes. And one of the things I was very impressed with on this lens was the amount of flare that you were actually able to see. Even in lighter environments and darker environments, I was able to get a clear and visible line going through. If that is important to you, let it be known that it's there. This is a neutral flare, so you don't have to worry about if it's too cool or too warm. Overall, as an anamorphic lens, I was very much pleased with how this performed compared to the previous versions. Now, what we've all been waiting for, how well is that autofocus? Straight out the box, I was not impressed. I'm gonna be very truthful. When I turned it on, there was a significant lag in autofocus as well as in manual focus. Now, I don't know if that's how the motors are designed to move, but as soon as I turned it one way, it would continue moving even when I was not moving at all. Which means that one, the autofocus system moves on a geared or motored system internally, which creates a sort of input lag, if you will. Now, that is straight out the box, and it immediately kind of turned me off. I wasn't getting as fast and responsive autofocus, and it would take a little bit just to focus in onto your subject. Now, number two is when I realized that there was an actual update to the lens. So I went on my computer, did a little click clack, found the update, connected the lens to my computer, and updated it. Easy, right? Problem solved. No. I still got a slight lag, and it wasn't as quick as compared to the Sui version. So in terms of run and gun, I wasn't actually able to properly use it. Or so I thought. Now, after a little bit of testing and realizing that changing a few settings in your actual camera helps the autofocus a little bit more, then I was able to actually use this for some run and gun scenarios. Now, if I were to say that it was convenient to do so, not really, but I guess that's all part of it. Bam. This is the run and gun setup here. So I learned that straight out the box, it's not great. After a little bit of update, it still wasn't the best. And even after tweaking some settings, I'd say it's still not comparable to the Sui 40mm that they created. Now, I will say the one thing about this lens is the fact that the autofocusing does not make a sound. Yeah. And because it does move on a certain motored system internally, that's how you get that more compact look. And also the fact that when you are switching between focus points, you actually get a nice transition between the two. Albeit it's not as quick, but once you kind of learn how to work with that, it actually starts to work out in your favor. Now, the main thing is that you do get an autofocusing anamorphic. After all of that, I will say there are some gives and some takes for this lens, but I do think it's worth it. I did find myself using this lens more often just because I did have that autofocus capability, and I still was able to get an anamorphic look. While it is a little bit tighter at 50 millimeters, especially on a crop sensor, I really didn't mind just because I really liked how it actually looked. And to be fair, we did have a full set of anamorphic lenses available to use. However, I still wanted to use this lens a lot more. I also very much appreciated the fact that Blazar was able to fit a lot into this tiny form factor, especially because they were still able to fit an autofocusing system inside, as well as shortening that little bit on the end with a direct Sony E-mount, as well as a smaller gear ring. And because of the actual image quality coming out of this lens, I actually enjoyed this a lot more because I was able to add in a lot more characteristics, as well as a certain kind of cinematic tone and mood. I did like playing with the more warmer tones and footage, as well as the more prominent flares that were actually happening from this lens. You could actually tell that this wasn't a spherical lens. Now, because of that autofocus, I will have to minus some points. It may not have been as fast as I would like, but it did work and it was very much usable in the scenarios that I was using it in. And I think with that character, it does bring a lot to your shots, especially if you're a creator looking for that certain tone in your projects. But at the end of the day, if you're looking for a compact autofocusing anamorphic lens, and especially if you're looking for a lens with a lot of character and a specific look to it, I would honestly go with this. And because you do still have an autofocusing feature, I think this is a great bang for your buck, and at a great focal length, you won't be disappointed. But if you like this video and you like learning about lenses like these, I would definitely like and probably subscribe if you haven't already. You don't have to, but much appreciated. All right, it's kind of late. I literally just drove in to do this, so I'm gonna go and eat.